want to talk about how you can get the most out of your abroad experiences. Doesn't matter whether you're visiting, whether you're studying, working in general, like living. But I really wanted to make this video because I feel like sometimes, like when we, I listen to this specifically when I teach students. A lot of times when they talk about traveling, the first thing they think of is Paris. And I really want you to get a very diverse aspect of whatever your target language is. So we're going to get started with that. The main thing I really want to emphasize is don't go where everyone goes, because again, that's kind of, I feel like sometimes when people think of, French culture, they think of France, and French culture is very global because there are a lot of different countries that speak French as a national or official language. So when we look at these different countries and these different nuances, if you're always going to Paris, or you're going to have a perception that Parisian culture represents the whole French-speaking world, or at least France, which is very diverse. It's very multifaceted when you really go and think about it. So what I really suggest is, like, for example, for me, like, since French is the most popular language that I teach, I would say if you're planning on traveling, don't go to Paris. I would say maybe go to like Belgium, or you can even go to, because Belgium is actually like Brussels is the center of the EU. So you might learn a little bit about that, especially if you're planning on studying like international relations or psycholinguistics, which is what I'm pretty much working on with my master's. And, just being able to get a nuanced perspective of the language. So you're not just getting used to speaking French in just like the typical, Parisian dialect. You get a diverse aspect of it. Or even if you do go to France, I would say find another aspect. Like I always recommend Bordeaux, because like if you're a wine lover, that's one of their charms. There are a lot of different festivals that happen throughout the country, throughout the year. So there's a lot of things you can really get involved in. There's also the fact that, you can even go to another country I really recommend is Luxembourg. Luxembourg, actually, I found out, is one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. And it's so small. It's a small country. And I think partly because, like, with small countries, it's, like, a lot easier to manage than, like, a large country like the United States. We have like hundreds of millions of people versus when you look at Luxembourg and like Liechtenstein, they're small countries, but there's a lot of really great qualities, and I think they're a hidden treasure if you really think about it. That kind of follows into my next point, which is to discover different dialects. So I always feel like, you learn a lot, especially if you're learning the language, is you kind of learn to kind of like nuances, like, oh, I've learned it this way, but apparently in Switzerland, Swiss French, they say it this way. You learn nuances, and sometimes you may discover that, oh, I have no idea that they speak this a certain way, especially because a lot of people know that, of course, Germany, they speak German, but then there's also Austria, there's even Switzerland, like Swiss German, I think there's Liechtenstein, I think also speaks German. You get these different nuances. And I remember one of my host's dad, when I was in Germany, he mentioned that when he was in Switzerland, he said, I had no idea what they're talking about. So you kind of will get a multifaceted perspective of how people say things. Like, for example, one thing is I learned in Belgian, the Belgian dialect is, they'll say things like, like how in French we typically learn when it's raining, we say, il pleut. Like, which literally means it's crying. But then when you say the same thing in Belgian French, it's il drache, those kinds of things. So you kind of learn the multifaceted. I remember when one of my friends from Belgium, he was saying that, I remember I think we were talking about some type of number, I don't remember, but like, I remember saying like 70, something like 70. 60 plus 10, because in France they like to multiply and add numbers after 60 because after 70 because they don't know what they're doing. They're like, oh, we don't say that. We just say c'est donc. It's simple. You kind of understand like the different facets that like also, the fact that I know that like specifically in Belgian, like their dialect sometimes can have like a different accent. Like not only do they say like dialect, they have different words for the same things that you would normally say in French, but then also is their accent might be different. One of the things I actually was researching a while back was, what is a Swiss accent? Like, what does that sound like? And it's their accent, like, it's really hard to distinguish the difference, but it's mainly you'll notice the word choices. Like there was a video I watched from Brut, and basically it was like, what do Swiss people think of French? And it's hilarious, like what their perception of French people is. Like, I think it's great when you look at, because I think they have one where it's like what Belgians think of French people. So that way you're kind of getting a different perspective of how other people within the French-speaking world, how they are perceiving each other. I also want to get to my next point, which is like asking questions, because sometimes I feel like we're afraid to ask. We're supposed to act like, oh yeah, I know everything. Like it's fine. Everything is fine. No, it's like one thing I was really confused on was when I was studying in Paris was, how do you get a coffee? Like, how do you go to a cafe and just order something? Because there's a whole ritual to it. And I kind of got scared. I got scared after the first try, but part of it is like learning like the actual, ritual of it. And maybe, just asking questions. Okay, like, is there a particular way that we do this? Is there a particular, like, do I sit down? Like, when they ask me this, like, placer ou emporter, what does that mean? Which obviously I know that means for here to go, So, learning these nuances of how you conduct yourself, like etiquette. Like particularly, I remember in Europe, it's specifically when I was I'm only speaking from my experience in France. Belgium was a little bit different, but they don't do to go, like, oh, I'll just have it to go. Or, like when you go to a restaurant and it's like, oh, I'm not finished with this, but I'll take it to go. Like, it's like, why would you do that? So a lot of times you really want to ask questions, especially if you have like a friend or someone I remember when I was in Mexico, I remember asking my one of my really good friends, because I was visiting him at the time, and I said, what are some things you don't do in Mexico? And and that's a really legitimate question to ask, because you don't want to do something that can be perceived as rude, that can kind of get you basically someone like, I don't know, like flip you off, or somebody just like be like, oh, well, F you, it's like, why would you say that? It's like something that can be perceived as rude. One of the things I always tell my students is not to confuse canard with connard, because these are two different words. It's like one letter can make the difference. It's like one, you're talking about a duck, and another one, you're talking about an asshole. Or a bastard, or you can use it in different ways. But basically, there's two different scenarios. One letter off can change the meaning. So these kinds of things are really important, especially when I teach my students. I always make sure I put like cultural aspects into it, so they're not just learning the language, but they know how to interact with the people. Okay. So that kind of also leads into my next point about learning like local culture. Like I was saying, I feel like you shouldn't be afraid to kind of go off on your own and try to leave areas where they might speak English more. I think that you should kind of challenge yourself and be in an environment where that target language is like, if you worked really hard to learn that language, you should, use it. I feel like, when I was in Paris, I remember like going off on my own, and then a lot of other students were afraid to do that. So, when you have that kind of that language skills, it really makes a difference, because you have more options of who you can talk to. So that's really, really important. Another thing is I would just say, like, if you're in a hotel or wherever where you have access to a television, I would suggest like turn on the television and see what people are watching, like, because like when you look at like news outlets, sometimes they may report news differently. One of the things that I notice is like when we talk about like, when the news is on in the US, a lot of news can sometimes feel like it's very fear-mongering. It can be very politically motivated. And, it's kind of like there's always like some form of like bias. Sometimes there are certain news outlets where it's always negative, and I refrain from watching American news because of that reason, because it just kind of stresses me out even more than I already am, and I already got enough problems in my daily life. So I particularly enjoy France 24. I rave about it all the time because they basically put everything in a more of objective perspective. It's more culturally motivated to say, like, here's what's going on in the world. They highlight different artists on different things. There's like a whole bunch of segments based on, different interests, like Tech 24, if you're really into technology and what's going on around that. Then there's also Actuel, which is mainly women's news. There's another one. It's called Elementaire, which I really like, which is Element Earth. It's more like environmental news, what's going on when it comes to climate change, or comes, to like certain environmental issues in general. All these different things that are catered to your interests. Like what kinds of movies or TV shows are on, because a lot of times you might find out that like maybe their sense of humor is a little bit different. I was recommending a student some French films, some of my top 3 French films, and I was kind of describing them. I said, I really want you to understand that as you watch this, humor might be a little bit different. What people find funny in one country may be different than what you might find in, your own country. So I really think that you should keep that in mind. Like, even if you don't understand what's going on in those situations, I really think you should at least see what's out there, what's going on, what is there out there to watch, So if you're not out, you're taking a break from going out and doing all these activities around the city or wherever it is you're at, you want to also, like, if you're taking a break and going back to your hotel room or wherever it is you're staying, you want to at least be able to, stay connected to what's going on, or what they're interested in, because that way when you learn more about the people, you can make more connections and we can live in a more peaceful society. So the last thing I also want to say is, like, find activities that you really like in that country. Like, like instead of going to the Eiffel Tower, which honestly locals will never go to the Eiffel Tower every single day. And there might be some who do, but it won't be everybody, every day we go to Eiffel Tower. Like, I would say, like, if you really love yoga, like, go find a yoga class. Like, people are practicing yoga everywhere. So, there's a chance that you will find people who are practicing yoga, and it's a great way for you to kind of like be doing something you love, and it's just in another language, and it's very visually it's very visual, because usually when you do yoga, you're usually watching someone demonstrate and then you do it. And like for me, I know that I went to a church when I was in France and when I was in Germany, because my faith is important. So I'm trying to find people to connect with that have the same faith, and I can actually talk about my faith in that language. Learning how to talk about things that you normally would be talking about. So, and then get, maybe like, challenging yourself to get yourself in situations where you can use like more complicated forms of conjugation. So like the conditional or the subjunctive, which, the subjunctive I teach last, but, generally I would say it's just putting yourself in positions where you can actually use what you've learned and challenge yourself, because I think sometimes you can be surprised by what because like it took me years to learn the subjunctive, and now that I've learned, found a way to teach it, because I actually learned the subjunctive while I was taking an advanced Italian course, and I was like, oh, that's how it works. So if it works in Italian, it must work the same way in French, and that's how I kind of figured it out when I looked more deeply into it. Now I teach it, to my students once they get to a certain level. So, in those kinds of situations, I feel like, you might get in a situation where you're talking and you realize, whoa, I just used the subjunctive. Oh my gosh, I just used this conjugation that I've never, I've been afraid to use. So I really recommend that. So anyway, I hope that this helps you get the most out of your study abroad experiences, so that you can make friends, live have a more holistic experience, and just enjoy life. So I hope this is really helpful, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Bye.